Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on your location. Thank you for joining us for today's National Conference of State Legislatures webinar. Our webinar today is hosted by NCSL's Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee and is part of the committee's 2015 Spring Webinar Series. For a complete schedule and registration list, visit our website at www.ncsl.org. My name is Jocelyn Durkay, and I am staff to the NRI Committee. I will be moderating today's webinar, where we will explore the role of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in developing federal environmental regulations and the interplay between states and the federal government. Before we begin, I wanted to review a few housekeeping items. Our webinar today is being recorded, and registrants will be able to access a recording of the webinar and presentation slides on NCSL's website. We will send out a notice shortly with a link to these resources. You can also download the webinar slides right now by clicking on the Media Library button. That is in the upper left portion of your screen. The icon appears like a blue chart in front of a yellow piece of paper, and the slides are available there. Environmental protection in the United States has always been an inherently joint venture between all levels of government, from small community initiatives to overarching federal policies. And while the federal government does its part to implement broad protection, the majority of daily environmental protection happens at the state and local levels. Through hearing from EPA representatives tasked specifically with working with state and local governments and seeing the progression of a very timely environmental regulation from the state perspective, you will hopefully leave today's webinar with a better understanding of the interconnected nature of environmental regulations at the federal and state levels, and how important it is for the federal government to work as a partner with state and local governments to protect the nation's environment. Our first speaker today will be a representative from EPA who will provide an overview of EPA's Federalism Consultation process, the role state agencies assume in regulations, and specific examples of how this process is executed. Our second speaker will provide a case study that will act as a detailed example of the federal-state interplay as it relates to federal ozone regulations. Our presenters will be answering questions both in between and after all presentations. Please type your questions in the question box on the left side of your screen at any time during the webinar. I will be monitoring them and will moderate the question and answer session at the end of the webinar. As a reminder, the NRI Committee hosted a webinar specifically exploring EPA's proposed guidelines for power plant carbon dioxide emissions on April 30th that is available on our website at www.ncsl.org. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Jack Bowles. Jack serves as Director of State and Local Relations at the Environmental Protection Agency. Jack has been in public service for 27 years, with most of those at EPA. He has served at the EPA Region 8, or Rocky Mountain, Office Director of State Programs, and for the last 8 years as EPA's National Director of State and Local Government Relations. He has spent much of his career at the nexus of federal and state environmental policymaking and implementation. Jack, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you, NCSL, for hosting this, and thank you especially to all the participants who are taking time away from what I'm sure is a busy Friday or early start to the weekend to hear our presentation. I want to start out with a little prologue. Environmental protection is a state EPA partnership, as Jocelyn said. As long as there have been federal environmental laws, it's been a state EPA partnership, going back not only to the original 1970 Clean Air Act and 1972 Clean Water Act, or NEPA from 1970, but you can go even further back into the 19th century, into the original Rivers and Harbors Acts, especially in the later part of the 19th century, where the state's roles were clearly spelled out. And one of my favorite factoids, which I'm happy to be able to pull out right now, is even before the federal government existed, even before the federal government thought about environmental protection, state legislators were busy protecting the environment. So, and this goes back to colonial days. I had an opportunity to do some research a while back, and what I could find is the earliest environmental statute comes from the state of South Carolina in 1671. Actually, it was a colony then, so it's from the Colonial Assembly. And they passed a law then that apparently is still in effect, and it reads thus, quote, should any person cause to flow into or be cast into any of the creeks, streams, or inland waters of this state any impurities that are poisonous to fish or destructive to their spawn, such person shall upon conviction be punished. So that's a pretty good law, actually, and the fact that it's still in effect, I think, speaks well to the wisdom, even hundreds of years ago, of state legislatures. And clearly, we could not have a national and state environmental enterprise and environmental protection system without the important roles of state legislatures. So I'm here, as Jocelyn said, I want to talk a little bit about EPA's Federalism Program. And as a lot of you are aware, states are co-regulators. The way the modern environmental statutes are set up, they put states in the role of implementers, on-the-ground implementers, local policymakers, the governor, state agencies, state legislatures all play a key role. As of right now, 2015, about 96%, let me flip this chart actually, about 96% of federal environmental programs that can be delegated to the states have been delegated. That's been a long process, and it's changed the role of both EPA and the states. EPA in the 70s was more of a direct implementation agency and organized to do that. EPA now is more of a facilitator and a standard setter and a partner with states in implementing these programs. And all along the way, state legislative action has been and is critical for an effective partnership and state program primacy. EPA, as part of its federalism efforts and programs, is very attentive to state legislative concerns. We think we enjoy a very good relationship with the NCSL folks. We're in contact with them regularly. We're talking about meetings and ways that we can get in front of state legislators or bring state legislators in to meet with us. And then we also have a national intergovernmental program. We have 10 EPA regions. A lot of you are probably familiar with our regional structure. And they're always available to work with state legislators during their sessions, before or after their sessions. We're more than willing to provide information, to provide briefings, or to provide technical assistance if requested. And that happens, as you all know better than anybody. That's where kind of most of the states are winding down their legislative sessions about now, or already have. So we've just gone through a whole season where I think every region was busy helping state legislators in one form or another with things we're working on. Now I'd like to turn to the crux of our federalism program, which is the executive order that President Clinton issued in 1999 on federalism. This executive order came not necessarily on the heels, but it came after a couple of statutes, the Unfunded Mandates Act, the Regulatory Flexibility Act, the Small Business and Small Entity Flexibility Act. And there was a strong recognition this time that federal agency regulations, and EPA is well known for its regulations, had a great impact on state governments and local governments. So during that era, and I was actually at CEQ at the White House Council on Environmental Quality during that time, there was put together this executive order. The Clinton administration worked very closely with the national intergovernmental associations such as NCSL to craft it. So the fact that we have this, what we consider to be a very robust process today at EPA to involve state and local governments really goes back to the efforts, to your efforts and the efforts of your national intergovernmental associations. It really wouldn't have happened, I think, without the major investment that they made into getting this program up and going. EPA's Federalism Program, we like to think, is the most proactive in the federal government. We actually had somebody from Georgetown University come study us, and they put out a very erudite and in-depth article on various agencies' federalism programs, and we came out very well on that. And I really have to give a shout out right now to Andy Hansen of our staff, who's been with this program since its inception and has really kind of marshaled it, steered it, carried it from its inaugural days in 2008 to where it is now. Pre-2008, 2009, the way the program worked was any major federal action that basically had an impact of a cumulative impact of over $100 million to state and local governments, or preempted state government action, would trigger formal federalism consultation as spelled out in the executive order. And real quickly, it's one line, I'll just explain what that is. So anytime there's a major action that triggers federalism, the agency, prior to formal promulgation of the regulation, must consult with state and local officials early in the process of developing the proposed regulation. So off of that very basic language and additional similar language for preemption, we've put together this program. What we figured out in 2008, 2009, 2007 was 100 million seemed to be very high. That only captured the very, very largest rules we did, and literally we were talking about once-in-a-decade rules back then that triggered the $100 million cost threshold. So because we wanted to make sure we were getting state and local views early in the process of every major rulemaking that impacted them, we, as an agency, lowered that threshold to $25 million. What that has done is has caused a tenfold increase in the EPA regulations subject to federalism consultation. So before 2008, I think there were 2 rules that triggered formally, and since then there have been about 19. An important point I'd like to make, I'm going to catch my slides up to my talking points here. Here we go. An important point I'd like to make is EPA doesn't, that federalism threshold is not a bright line for us necessarily. Our rule internally for consultation is if it's important to state and local governments, it's important enough to consult on. So, we have been and can get into legal discussions about whether, or economic discussions about whether something triggers federalism, but we just don't think that's a productive use of your time and our time. And basically, if you think it's an action that deserves consultation, we agree with you, and we will consult with you. A real quick rundown of how this process works. So you may be aware that there is a kind of a government-wide register of prospective regulations that goes out. I think it's a 6-month review, or it lists all the regulations that are going out, supposed to be proposed or initiated in the next 6 months, or it comes out every 6 months. I think it actually goes out a few years. So that's a very good source of information for those of you who are trying to keep track of what's on the horizon in terms of possible future EPA or action or regulations from other agencies. I will say that in years past that has not been a very reliable guide, but OMB has gone out of its way the last few years to make sure it does reflect reality. So if you want a good sense of what's going to happen in the future, that regulatory guide is a good product. So the way it works here at EPA, we may have an action that we know is going to be on the horizon. So there'll be, once we realize that we're going to be we're getting ready to prepare to propose a rule, we'll put together a pre-proposal briefing. And only state and local governments get this. No other stakeholders can do this. And the reason that can happen is not just the executive order, but because state and local officials are exempt from FACA, which is the Federal Advisory Committee Act. Other stakeholders, you can't just go out to one group. So we can't go out to just environmental groups or just to industry to kind of figure out where we need to go with the regulation that early on. We can go to state and local governments. It's, I think, a great privilege that's afforded to the partnership, and we'd like to take advantage of it. So as early as we can have a good sense of what our major possible options are with regard to a rulemaking or a major policy action. Excuse me, I'm closing my door. We'll put together a briefing. The way that will work, we'll get the program office together. They'll put together as much information as they're able to share. We'll invite members of the intergovernmental associations like NCSL, Conference of Mayors, NACO, National Governors. We'll do a very thorough rundown of what we're contemplating. There'll be a period before proposal when state and local officials can provide comments, or the associations can provide comments. And even if we have enough time, we'll even work with individual associations like NCSL or NACO to do a kind of a second-tier consultation where we can have webinars or conference calls with the members, with state legislators themselves or county officials themselves or mayors. That way we get very, very good feedback early on, keeps the agency from going down roads that probably would not be productive in terms of eventual regulation. And I think all parties involved in this believe that it results eventually in the promulgation of a better product. The consultation does not stop at proposal. During the comment period, we continue to engage the state and local governments on a regular basis, more so than any other stakeholders. And we make sure that their comments basically my office will work with the program office, the air, water, or water office, to make sure we are capturing all the valuable comments from state and local officials, and they receive full consideration before the final rule comes out. And then when the rule comes out, there's a section called the Federalism Summary Impact Statement, where the program and the agency will detail all the consultation it's done, provide a summary of state and local comments on the proposal, and explain how the agency addressed all those comments and concerns. With regard to state legislatures' input, EPA, the agency is aware that state legislatures craft the authority and resources to implement many federal and state environmental laws and regulations. An example, we know of 10 states at least that require legislative approval for Clean Air Act and NAAQS state implementation plans. And we want to make sure all those state legislative factors are considered in the final rule that comes out. An example of that, which we're always aware of and always working with NCSL on, is legislative calendars. We know that not every legislature meets annually. Some meet biannually. And we want to make sure that if a regulation does require a state legislature to take action, that there's ample opportunity for that state legislature to meet and to take appropriate action. I wanted to give a quick example of how this has worked in the real world. And a lot of you are familiar with this. This is the coal combustion residual rule, otherwise known as coal ash. And you might recall in early on, I think it was 2009, there was the coal ash incident in Tennessee, which triggered a lot of it was a very tragic event, and it triggered a lot of desire for the agency to take action to to figure out how we can better deal with the risk of coal ash in the future. So we began the EPA's Solid Waste Office, Emergency Response Office, OSWR. In 2009, they started to figure out how they would put together, what kind of rule they would put together, what were the options. We hosted the first Federalism Consultation under our new order. And a lot of you will recall that all through this process from 2009 until it was finally promulgated last year, the agency and stakeholders were kind of wrestling with two different approaches, whether or not to regulate coal combustion residuals under Subtitle C, which is the hazardous waste section of the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. Obviously, Subtitle C would mean a lot more stringent requirements, probably more costly. And I think everybody was wrestling with the cost-benefit of Subtitle C versus Subtitle D. We received more than 200 state local comments on this rule. Those comments overwhelmingly supported regulating coal combustion residuals as solid waste under Subtitle D of RCRA. And after spending literally a couple years with the states, with localities who owned coal ash ponds and coal ash facilities, EPA managed to get to a place where we could promulgate a rule that did go the Subtitle D route and really did reflect, I think more than anything else, the extensive and intensive input of state and local governments. So we're very pleased with how that worked out, and the reason I do mention CCR is because it is really the first rule that's gone all the way through our new federalism process from beginning to end. And fortunately, we think it's a good model and one that we can hopefully emulate going forward. As I mentioned, we have several other actions underway. A lot of you are aware of those. We have a fairly full consultation calendar. We have had a fairly full one the past year or so, and we look forward to your continued involvement and continued comments on how, and all of your involvement definitely helps the agency, helps all of us put together better programs that better protect the environment for the American people. And with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it back over to Jocelyn.
Thank you very much, Jack. That was very informative. We look forward to hearing your response to some of the questions we've been getting in and that we will get in going forward. As a reminder to our audience, you can type in a question into the chat box at any time. And before I introduce our next speaker, Jack, I did have a question that I wanted to follow up with for you. Beyond the formal federalism consultation process that you just outlined, what are some of the informal ways that EPA works with states during the proposal or the implementation phase of a regulation that may not trigger that full federalism consultation?
Okay, if I understand your question, ways that EPA will work with states in ways that do not trigger the full federalism consultation?
Correct.
Okay, so what triggers the federalism consultation is basically an internal evaluation that says either the rule will cause state and local governments to incur at least $25 million collectively in compliance costs, or preempt state legal authority, or there's also provision for small governments where it would mean that they would have to spend more than 1% of their budget complying with a rule. So if we think that a rule is kind of borderline, or maybe, for example, I'll tell you up front, NACs, a lot of standard setting rules don't technically trigger the federalism consultation, 25 million requirement, but we do consult on those anyway. So we have a variety of mechanisms. A lot of you are probably familiar with Janet McCabe. She's been out to speak with various groups of state legislators all over the country at your national meetings, at your legislative forums. So we'd like to have get EPA speakers out before state legislators. when y'all visit town, we do everything we can to host you and bring you over here so we can have fairly intimate discussions about what's going on, what your issues are, what we're doing, how what we're doing and your issues interact. So basically, as much interaction as possible. I don't think we get enough of personal visits from state legislators or state legislative staff or meetings. We have a lot of people here in D.C. and we have a lot of people working hard on standards and regulations and programs. And we view our role as trying to bring as many stakeholders in to ground truth everything we're doing here. So the more stakeholders we have, the more people we can talk to, the more issues that come before us, the better ground truth our rules end up being, and the better our programs and your programs end up being.
Thank you. With that, I will introduce our next speaker. We're pleased to have Bill Becker with us. He is Executive Director of the National Association of Clean Air Agencies, or NACA. NACA is an association of state and local air pollution control agencies in 43 states, the District of Columbia, and 4 territories. NACA's members have a primary responsibility under the Clean Air Act for implementing the nation's air pollution control programs. Mr. Becker established NACA in 1980 and serves as the association's chief spokesperson and liaison with Congress, elected state and local officials, federal officials, and public and private interest groups. And this is done with the goal of giving state and local air regulators an effective voice in the development and implementation of clean air laws, regulations, and policies. Bill, with that, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn, and good afternoon, everyone. I am thankful that you've invited me to participate on your webinar. It's nice to follow Jack in trying to provide a case study of how the states, at least the state environmental agencies, work with EPA on an environmental issue. And I've chosen the most benign, boring, non-controversial issue that I could think of that I guess you can't see me, there's a little facetiousness there, that demonstrates quite well the relationship and the dependency between federal and state governments on this particular issue. I'm happy at the end of my presentation during the question and answer period to address other issues besides ozone, but I thought addressing ozone would really kind of put things in perspective and follow nicely from what Jack has laid out. So what I'm going to cover pretty quickly is why there's even a need for an ozone standard, what the law requires, what it requires of EPA, what it requires of the states, and what we depend upon in order to implement a rule like this successfully. And you could easily change out ozone and put in fine particulate or climate change or anything you wanted, but this is sort of a typical federal-state relationship. So Congress typically passes a law, in this case the Clean Air Act, and with the Clean Air Act they said to EPA, we would like you to identify and list certain air pollutants, and the law actually listed the air pollutants, although they can add to them, and we would like you, EPA, to ensure that air quality is safe to breathe. And if there are health or welfare problems associated with a certain level, it's incumbent upon you, EPA, to set that level. And the Congress put in place a process to develop that standard for EPA to follow, and a period of time that EPA was to re-examine the standard and decide if it was appropriate to revise the standard. And so EPA over the years has just done that. And in the context of today's ozone standard, the agency is smack dab in the middle of reassessing whether the smog standard should continue to be set at 75 parts per billion, or whether it should be tightened to a more stringent level that adequately protects public health with an adequate margin of safety. And what the Congress did many years ago is they decided to help EPA make this decision. And there was established a panel of independent scientists to review the criteria, to review the studies, and to make recommendations to the EPA administrator. So Congress set the law. Congress said, we're going to help you, Ms. Administrator, administer the law by providing you with some guidance, but we're going to give you flexibility with regard to whether or not you choose to follow that guidance and the range or the number in which the number you choose within that range. And so the review process that EPA has set up and that is open to the public consists of several steps. I won't get into all of them now, but basically it's to review the integrated plan, it's to review the science, the risk exposure, and other related policies. And again, these authorities are derived very specifically under the Clean Air Act, the congressionally approved legislation. Fast forwarding to today, EPA has gone through this process. There are independent scientists who advise EPA have made a recommendation, and their recommendation, hopefully many of you on the call know this, was to tighten the standard from 75 parts per billion to a range between 60 and 70 parts per billion. Now, they left the administrator some wiggle room. And what the administrator did recently is she decided to propose for public comment the upper end of that range, between 65 and 70. EPA felt that taking the CASAC recommendation down to 60 was a bit too iffy. EPA wasn't convinced it needed to be tightened that low, but CASAC, the scientists, felt that a standard within 65 to 70 made perfect sense, at least to the agency. And with regard to the secondary standard, which protects not health but welfare effects, they proposed to keep it consistent with the primary standard. Okay, so here's where states come in, not just state legislatures, but state air pollution agencies and state utility commissions and energy offices and power plants and manufacturers and all stakeholders. EPA is required to hold public hearings, Jack mentioned this, and to hold them in parts of the country that generally have the greatest impact. And EPA did hold hearings. They got hundreds of witnesses. They received, I'm sure, tens of thousands of comments, and they are allowing, under the Administrative Procedures Act, every affected entity, whether it's a person or a company or a government, to respond. And in this case, and in most cases with EPA regulations, the agency is under court order to issue a decision because they've been late in the past, and some group, typically an environmental group, is tired of excusing their tardiness and has worked it out where they've gotten EPA to commit through the courts to a certain time period. Again, EPA wasn't required to tighten the standard. They were required to make a decision one way or another. And if they decided to tighten it, typically they pick a number within CASAC's suggested range. So continuing on this theme of sort of federal-state relations and the handoff between EPA and the states, once the standard is set, and it will be in October, and it's likely, if I had to guess, it'll be set closer to 70 parts per billion than 65 parts per billion. Once the standard is set, then the law, not EPA, requires certain things take place in a fairly timely manner. And this is not just for ozone, but for all of the other so-called criteria pollutants, including sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxides and particulate matter. Within 2 years after the standard, so by 2017, areas are designated as either being in attainment or clean air status, or not attainment, dirty air status, not meeting the standard. And this designation process is really a negotiation between a governor and EPA. And the breadth of the designation area, the geographic area, is very important because that will dictate whether manufacturing facilities are subject to regulations or not, and whether the area has to adopt certain transportation measures and so forth. So that's a very important process, and oftentimes it goes back and forth between the federal government and the state. And then within 3 years after promulgation, closer to 2018, states are required to submit what is called an infrastructure state implementation plan. This is not the full-fledged implementation plan that codifies all the air pollution rules and regulations that are necessary to attain the standard. This is more like the structure to show that the state is capable of meeting the standard, that there's sufficient resources provided by the state legislatures to help the states comply. And then within 3 or 4 years after the designation is effective, the states actually are required to submit those full-fledged, comprehensive state implementation plans. And with these, there's another process, and it's a public one. And many of you, hopefully representing state legislatures, are aware of how this works. Pretty much what happens is the state will sit down, will conduct some fairly sophisticated mathematical modeling, and will determine how much emissions reductions of smog precursors there will be needed to attain the standard within a statutory deadline. And the state literally arrays all of the major reductions, both from large sources, area sources, which are sort of the diffuse, pervasive sources, and from transportation sources. And the state kind of goes down, the list until it can calculate the amount of emissions reductions that will be necessary to show compliance in a later year. And that is a public, transparent process that requires adoption in state rule, and legislatures oftentimes are part of that process, depending upon what rules need to be codified in the plan. And then once that plan is developed, then states have anywhere from 3 to 20 years to attain the standard. So some areas like South Coast and maybe Houston, have until, in the 2030 time period to attain. Others have the controls that take place more expeditiously. I want to make just a side comment, and maybe it will encourage some reaction from some of the participants, which is my goal. And that is, just on this point about deadlines and the state implementation plans, this new ozone standard, wherever it's set, will likely not require the first ounce of smog-forming emissions to be reduced from an infected facility with a couple of exceptions for close to a decade. And yet there's an avalanche of negative reaction by some sectors to this rule, which hasn't even been promulgated yet. The plans haven't been set yet. And as I have been showing you in the time frame, the deadlines, allow for many years before the plan is developed and then the sources are required to be implemented. And so some are saying this is the most expensive rule in environmental history. I've heard that before, but the fact of the matter is it's impossible to say, and we don't know what the future is going to be 8 years from now. So I would urge, for all stakeholders to kind of keep their powder dry until they see what EPA does and what the state does vis-a-vis a particular industry, and then, comment on the adequacy of that rule or not. Okay, let's move on. If we're going to do our job, and at least we are state and local environmental agencies, and the job is to carry out the Congress's mandate to clean up the air by certain deadlines, we can't do it alone. Not only do we need support from state legislatures, but we also need support, and this comes back to Jack, from EPA. This is a federal-state partnership. This is not a federal ambient air quality standard. This is a national ambient air quality standard. Congress understands that this is a shared responsibility, and if one level of government fails, then the public doesn't distinguish there. They'll think that all levels of government fail, and they won't distinguish between state legislatures or state environmental agencies or federal EPA. So it's important for government to try to work together as much as possible to make these programs work. And we need help from EPA. And for example, when EPA comes out with an ozone standard in October, they should at the same time be coming out with timely implementation rules and guidance. And unfortunately, this is not Jack's fault, but it's an agency fault. They've been late in the past, and it's not fair to states, and it's not fair to stakeholders who want to know the rules of the game. They want to know, what's expected as they conduct their public hearings, so they can tell industry and they can tell stakeholders the impacts. Also, there are certain things that we can't control on our own, and it's important that EPA do the heavy lifting on some of these national measures. Generally speaking, we can't regulate trucks unless EPA does it, or unless California decides on its own to do something different, then we can opt in. We can't regulate airplanes. It's tough for us to regulate trains. There are a number of measures that EPA could take to help reduce emissions, and these measures are of national significance. And thirdly, and I know EPA and the administration is trying, our success in implementation is largely dependent upon the tools and the resources that we get to help run this program. The Clean Air Act authorizes EPA to fund up to 60% of a state's program to meet the clean air goals, and the states would have to come up with the rest. In reality, EPA is funding not 60%, but less than 25%. And the states have to fill that gap if they're serious about meeting their commitments. And it's not fair for legislatures to have to continuously make up for the gap that is existing at the federal level because, for whatever reason, Congress has decided not to provide states with those resources. And that's becoming a big problem, and the gap is widening. So this was a quick and dirty discussion of how ozone fits into the federal-state partnership that Jack has provided. But I could do this for any other pollutant, but I'll stop here and see if you have any questions for Jack or me.
Thank you very much, Bill. We appreciate you being here and sharing with us. I did have a question for you. You've been with NACA since its founding in 1980. How has the state-federal partnership and interaction with EPA changed in those years? Do you feel it's better or worse, and what do you see in the future?
Gosh, so I've been through different administrations, and it's been different from administration to administration, and some Republican administrations have been kinder to us than Democratic, and some Democratic have been kinder to the state environmental agencies than Republican. I think it's part of it is, I think part of it is driven by who's sitting in the White House and how much he has really wanted state input. But I will say this, and I know we're not talking about climate, and I'm not going to comment necessarily on the substance of the Clean Power Plan, but I think EPA deserves an immense amount of credit for opening the door and for being there to listen to states' concerns over the past year and a half as they have been developing their Clean Power Plan. And I'm not saying at the end, states are going to like it or not, but what I'm saying is, since I've been in this job, I've seen an unprecedented level of interaction between EPA and the states on this program. I worry that they can't keep doing this. They can't sustain the effort. And I know that Gina McCarthy, the administrator, has said on many occasions, perhaps in different words, we'll meet with any state, anytime, anywhere. And they really have followed through with that. So while things have been good and bad over the past 30-some years, on this particular issue of the Clean Power Plan, the agency, at least with regard to listening and interaction, has been amazing. Now we'll see whether or not they carry that over into making changes to the final standard, but in terms of interaction, they've been quite remarkable.
Thank you. I had a question for both of you, Bill and Jack. You'd provided several successful examples to the Federalism Consultation process, but what do you see as challenges to the success of this process?
I mean, I can. Jack, do you want to start? I'll be very brief, Bill. Yeah, the challenge. I think the biggest challenge I see, and I can say this because I'm career staff at EPA, is breaking through kind of the headline political partisanship on various environmental issues and getting down to the real business of protecting the environment for the American people. I think everybody reads the newspaper and knows what the climate is in Congress. But what I fear is I really kind of fear a kind of, I don't know, a broadening or spreading of that kind of partisanship across the country. Over the decades, EPA's enjoyed a great partnership with states and a very practical partnership with states, especially at the state agency level and with state legislators and governors, everybody, in terms of figuring out how we do what we need to do. And I just hope that going forward we can all continue that relationship. And I'm optimistic we can. And I just want to echo what Bill said about the current administrator. She will meet with anybody, anywhere, at any time to hear concerns. We are as receptive to stakeholder input now as this agency's ever been. Thanks.
So, maybe a couple of challenges. One is there are certain things. So when Jack was talking about history and starting, from the beginning, the EPA oversight role that they administered with regard to states was one of, I don't want to insult anybody, but it was kind of like a parent over a child. Well, today and in previous years, many states have more expertise on some of these air pollution issues than EPA. And it's no longer, sort of parental supervision. It's, we're equal partners. And a lot of times we say it, people say it and they don't really mean it. And so when we have to do things differently these days, sometimes it's difficult for, career staff or regional staff to really catch up because they're used to, looking at every single state implementation plan with such precision that these things are delayed. And the management that comes in generally tries to crack that and break it open, but oftentimes it takes time to get down to the career staff. And again, I'm not including Jack in this. He's in a different department that's not one of the programmatic or regional offices. So that's a challenge. We're making progress. Perhaps we could be making more progress. The other thing is I've seen over the years that there is a tension between whether EPA makes a decision that could ameliorate a national problem with one stroke of the pen, or whether they take the easy way out and defer that tough decision to 50 different states. And I guess it depends upon what side of the fence you're on as to whether you want EPA to make the decision or you want a top-down or a bottom-up approach. But I can tell you that there had been examples of where it would have been really nice for EPA to do what needs to be done to avoid fights in 50 different states or 50 different state legislatures and do it in one fell swoop. But I guess generally speaking, I wish the question, we don't have time to answer it, but I wish the question would have been, what's working well? And there are so many examples of how we've really turned the corner and are working very responsibly to clean up the air together.
Thank you. And I was wondering if you'd each take a minute and share, in your respective roles, what you see as information that's essential for state legislators and staff to know in conclusion for the webinar today.
Well, okay, I'm going to be a little edgy in my response, and but I want to be totally transparent in that, and that is, I want to talk about the Clean Power Plan for a minute, and I will leave you with this. Unless Congress or the courts force states, including state legislatures, to stand down, the states, and I mean this broadly, are required by law to implement this program. And if the states are constrained because of model rules that some are promoting, or because of state legislature actions, and I don't see too many of them, but I've seen some, one of two things is going to happen. Either it's going to make it far more difficult because of the curtailment of the flexibility embedded in the proposal to comply, and it's going to increase costs for compliance, or worse, if a state stands down entirely, then EPA will have no alternative than to impose a federal plan. And when we speak with utilities, the investor-owned, the publicly owned, and the rural electric cooperatives, they abhor the federal government telling them what to do. They abhor federal plans. And so I understand the politics. My members understand the politics. But if I had one recommendation for state legislatures, and I realize I see the list of the participants on the phone, I would say give this rule a chance if it goes forward. Give states, including your own states, an opportunity after changes are made from proposal to final to make it more palatable to states, an opportunity to use all the flexibilities that are provided, and it's a totally flexible approach, and work with your energy offices, your utility commissions, and others to see if you can come up with an acceptable plan. Don't give up at the outset, as some are being asked to do, but try to work cooperatively. And I'm happy, to help out NCSL and its members any way we can. We just have a new menu of options that we provided that I hope you all, Jocelyn, will send out to your members. And we're also going to come out with model rules to help states and state legislatures, see the flexibility and comply.
Thanks, Bill. That was a great answer. One thing I would add is, as I mentioned during the presentation, we have 10 regional offices. Each regional office has an intergovernmental contact liaison. They have people from all the major programs. And one of the things we do is we kind of monitor what's going on in state legislatures around the country, especially with regard to major initiatives such as the Clean Power Plan or Clean Water Rule or anything that we're doing. One thing that we don't do, though, is EPA takes the prerogatives of states seriously. We don't interject ourselves into the state legislative process. Sometimes we're itching to provide technical assistance, but we won't do that unless we're requested by either the state environmental agency, the state legislative staff, or the governor's office. We're not just going to intrude. We really, if people want EPA's views, we really hope that we're asked. And I think I would hope that we're asked more often, because a lot of times, I know there are a lot of pressures on state legislatures. You're getting language from a lot of sources. Sometimes our attorneys may think something means something that other attorneys don't. I think it's always good that we all reach a common understanding about the long-term impacts of potential legislative language. And because, one example, Bill's exactly right. Most states and most of the stakeholders in states would abhor it for EPA to have to come in and implement a program or whatever itself. So, and that's our goal too. Our goal is to help support state programs, and we want to do everything we can to do so. So we hope we're asked more often for technical assistance if it's felt to be necessary. Thanks.
Thank you both. And I did mention in conclusion, but we did have a question come in that I did wanted to make sure that we addressed from one of our participants. And it is asked in a broad manner. It says, what happens to those states that do not reach attainment? So I'm not sure if it's specifically in reference to Section 111D or if it's in regards to ozone, but if either of you have a response to that, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. So I'll answer for both. On ozone, when we worked on the Clean Air Act during the 80s, our battle cry was sanction us for failing to try, not for trying and failing. Because reducing air pollution and complying with a smog standard, which is comprised of multiple pollutants like volatile organic compounds and nitrogen oxides, is very challenging and is not easy. And so we said to Congress, and they listened, that if we submitted a plan and it was approved by EPA and we did everything in the plan that we said we would do, but we still couldn't reach attainment, you shouldn't punish us. You shouldn't sanction us. And what Congress did is they said, okay, what's left, though, is we're going to have to ask you to do more. We will bump you up into a more severe category, and we will give you more time, but we expect you to do more because the air is still dirty. At the time, states thought that was fair, including NCSL in those days, and it seems to have worked, although some areas have actually been asked to be bumped up. So if a state doesn't submit a plan or doesn't implement the provisions because it just doesn't like it, then there are sanctions in the Clean Air Act, including the withholding of highway funds, and what is akin to a construction ban. It's requiring 2-to-1 offsets for new facilities. And with regard to the Clean Power Plan, as I said, if a state doesn't submit a plan in a timely manner, and EPA, I'm not speaking for EPA, but I know EPA, they will cut slack on this. But if the state has decided, from the get-go to stand down and to not do it and to kind of snub its nose, then EPA has said they're not going to punish states by taking away their highway funds. They're not going to do that. But what they will do is issue a federal plan which is less flexible and more costly than what a state could do on its own.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that came in, there was a clarification question around ozone and the air quality standards with relation to that says, what are some of the most common examples of emission systems that would fall under this regulation? Is it just the power sector, or are there other sources?
Well, that's a very good question. And the answer is, first of all, the Clean Air Act sets a threshold to distinguish between major sources and minor sources. And that threshold is anywhere from 50 tons of pollution to 100 tons of pollution, although some states have found it necessary to lower that threshold. The second point is that any major source, not just power plant, emitting volatile organic compounds and or nitrogen oxide, so it's combustion, it's any combustion source, also facilities like dry cleaners, even some of the smaller facilities that are not, the example we used to use in the old days, bakeries, dry cleaners, and auto body refinishing shops, not in the marginal non-attainment areas, but in some of the more serious non-attainment areas, will be required to retrofit. And these aren't your corner bakeries. These are like your regional Entenmann's bakery, something more of a distributor. But they expect, Congress and EPA expect that facilities that are major, not minor, and who emit these precursor emissions will be required to adopt control measures.
Excellent.
That answers the question.
Thank you. And for our audience, there was 1 or 2 questions regarding the Clean Power Plan and Section 111D. I wanted to remind our audience that we had an entire webinar exploring that topic that does answer some of the questions asked in that, and that is accessible through the hyperlink that's displaying now on everyone's screens. There are both slides and a recording.
So maybe you want to give me a chance to answer it quickly so that the person doesn't have to go away in tears?
Sure. If you would like to, what are the current prospects for 111D? Are major changes likely due to state input?
So, okay, so this is the Bill Becker personal response. It's not uneducated, but I'm not the only one with an opinion. I think 111D is going to go forward. I wouldn't be horribly shocked if 1 or more courts weighed in, but I think in the end it's going to go forward. What are the prospects? What was the other piece of the question?
Are major changes likely?
Oh, yes.
To state input.
Yes, and I'll tell you, and I think changes are likely, and I'll tell you in a couple of areas where I will predict they will be. First, some of the state goals will change considerably because EPA, I shouldn't be answering this, Jack should, but I'll take him off the hook here. Some of the changes will be made to state targets because EPA and the state, decided subsequent to the initial proposal to work things out. Secondly, I will predict that there's two pieces, targets to the deadlines to the Clean Power Plan. There's a 2030 end deadline, which not many are really balking at too much. But there's a 2020 interim deadline, which requires a substantial amount of the total target to be met 10 years earlier or only a couple or 3 years after a plan is submitted. And every stakeholder, including most states, have said, that's just too darn quick, and it takes away the flexibility and time you're giving us till 2030. And so EPA is going to change that. They may change, they could change the baseline that measures reductions. They may give some more credit for certain things like nuclear or hydro. So I think you can expect a number of changes that will come closer to critics, including our agencies, concerns. But I think the program will go forward. Jack, do you want to add or differ with me?
Bill, I think you've proven to be an excellent prognosticator in the past, and I'll just quote the administrator again. There's never been a final rule that has not changed from its proposal based on stakeholder input. So yes, there will be some key changes in the rule based on stakeholder input. And Bill's prognostications are probably as good as anybody's.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both. I wanted to extend a thank you again to you, Bill and Jack, for speaking today, and also to thank our attendees for participating. As a reminder, a recording of today's webinar and the presentation slides will be made available. Everyone will receive an email shortly about how to access these resources and to register for upcoming webinars, or you may click the link displaying now for the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee Spring Series. Next Friday's webinar will explore how to calculate the costs of traffic safety interventions. Thank you all for your continued interest and support of NCSL, and I hope to see everyone in Seattle at NCSL's August Legislative Summit. Have a great weekend, and thank you again.